200 pairs of eyes stared in absolute shock, watching my wife lie face down on the earth, her finest dress completely ruined. Nearby, my son wrapped a comforting arm around his new bride and whispered something into her ear that made her burst into laughter. For a brief moment, I stood frozen in place. Then, with deliberate, slow steps, I walked toward the front of the room where the microphone stood. Nobody in the crowd expected what was coming next. I tapped the metal casing once. The sound cut through the air, and the live band immediately stopped playing. Every single face in the venue turned to look at me. My daughter-in-law's father slowly lowered his drink to the table. I spoke into that microphone for less than 30 seconds. Before the servers even had a chance to slice into the wedding cake, I was already on the phone with my attorney. The celebration was shattered, and nothing would ever be the same after that moment. Just minutes earlier, I had been standing on the grand veranda of the Oak Ridge estate, watching my wife get shoved directly into a wet patch of ground by our son's brand new bride. The immediate aftermath was defined by an eerie, suffocating silence. 200 guests had witnessed the entire thing, yet not a single person uttered a sound. The musicians had kept playing their instruments as if nothing out of the ordinary had occurred. Near the bar, someone let out a nervous chuckle. Our daughter, Chloe, was already rushing over to help her mother, but she was 20 feet away, and it would take her precious time to cross the crowded space. My wife, Eleanor, was resting on her side right in the middle of the garden bed. It was a section of land the property staff had heavily watered that very morning to ensure the blossoms looked vibrant for the afternoon photographs. Her cream-colored gown, a piece she had spent months searching for, was now stained with dark, wet earth from her shoulder all the way down to the hemline. She wasn't getting up. She just lay there in shock. I had been watching the scene unfold from the opposite side of the veranda, where I was locked in a polite, standard conversation with a local businessman named Arthur Finch about his commercial real estate projects. In that instant, my brain began processing the visual information in a strange, detached order. First, I noticed that Eleanor's heels had slipped completely off her feet. Next, I watched Chloe, our daughter-in-law of exactly 2 hours, turn her back on the mess she had just created. Finally, my eyes tracked my 35-year-old son, Julian. He walked right up behind Chloe, placed his hand firmly around her waist, leaned down, and muttered something directly into her ear. She laughed. It wasn't a panicked chuckle, nor was it an embarrassed gasp of disbelief. It was a genuine, full-throated laugh. It was the exact type of sound a person makes when someone tells a deeply amusing joke. That was the precise second a cold, heavy sensation settled deep into my chest. It wasn't hot anger yet. It was a completely different feeling, like watching a massive, heavy door slam shut before you even realized it was unlocked. Arthur stood right next to me, blinking in disbelief. He muttered a quiet exclamation, asking what on earth had just happened. I didn't bother giving him an answer. I was already moving across the flagstones, but I wasn't heading toward Eleanor. Chloe had already reached her side. Instead, I marched directly toward the musical setup near the rear of the veranda, where the performers were preparing for the dinner transition. The main coordinator of the band saw me approaching. He looked to be a younger guy, maybe in his late 30s, holding a microphone in one hand and a detailed schedule of the evening's events in the other. I pointed directly at the device and asked to borrow it. He looked completely baffled for a split second, but he handed it over without demanding an explanation. I walked straight to the absolute center of the veranda. The stone tiles felt incredibly warm beneath my shoes. The sun was beginning its slow descent behind the massive oak trees at the very edge of the estate, casting that perfect golden hour illumination that media companies charge a premium to capture. I could clearly see the elaborate floral arrangements sitting on every single guest table, pristine white roses and delicate hydrangeas. Each centerpiece cost exactly $42. I knew the precise amount because I had personally settled the invoice the previous month. I could see the large ice sculpture positioned right next to the bar area, slowly weeping water into the evening heat. And then I saw 200 distinct faces turn completely toward me as I gave the top of the microphone a sharp tap. The sudden thud echoed sharply across the entire lawn, and the string instruments finally went completely silent. Julian and Chloe were standing near the bar area. Chloe already had a fresh beverage in her hand, filled with sparkling champagne, and her facial expression was that of someone who had instantly determined her actions were entirely inconsequential and that everyone else simply needed to move past it. Julian looked completely different. Nervousness was setting in, as if he had just realized a storm was approaching but had no idea how to shelter from it. Arthur Finch lowered his glass onto the table. His wife, Martha, let her face fall from mild curiosity into something much colder and harsher. I looked directly at Julian first, then shifted my gaze to Chloe, and finally addressed the rest of the gathered crowd. I expressed my gratitude to everyone for taking the time to attend the event. My voice sounded remarkably solid and level, even though my hands were trembling. I announced that, unfortunately, Eleanor and I would be departing immediately and would not be staying for the formal dinner service. I watched Chloe's face drop. She clearly hadn't anticipated this reaction, and I wanted every single person in attendance to understand something vital. I paused for a beat, allowing the weight of the moment to sink in. I stated clearly that I would not be associated with cruelty, not on that day, and not ever. With that, I handed the microphone right back to the musical director, who grasped it carefully as if the metal might burn his skin. The entire veranda fell into a state of absolute, profound silence. Even the local birds seemed to have stopped chirping in the trees. I walked across the stone floor to the spot where Chloe was kneeling in the dirt next to Eleanor. She had managed to wipe away most of the heavy mud from Eleanor's arms, but the fabric of the gown was completely destroyed, and there was no denying it. Eleanor was weeping quietly, not making a sound, just letting tears stream down her face while she stared blankly ahead to nothing. I took hold of Eleanor's hand and told her we were leaving. She simply nodded in response. She didn't say a word, she just gave a small nod. Chloe looked up at me from the ground, offering to help her mother reach the vehicle, but I told her I had everything under control.
As we made our way toward the parking area at a very slow pace, mainly because Eleanor's footwear was still buried somewhere in the flower bed and she was walking completely barefoot, I heard Julian's voice shout out from behind us, begging me to wait. I didn't slow down. I didn't bother turning around to look at him. I simply kept moving forward. Once we reached the safety of the parking lot, Eleanor finally spoke, her voice incredibly faint. She looked at me and whispered that she had been pushed. She explained that Chloe had placed both hands squarely on her shoulders and shoved her with significant force right in front of the entire crowd. I told her I knew. She asked why anyone would do such a thing. I carefully assisted Eleanor into the front passenger seat. The wet dirt from her dress immediately stained the premium leather interior, but the condition of the car was the absolute last thing on my mind. I shut the door, walked around to the driver's side, climbed in, and turned the key in the ignition. The climate control system immediately kicked on, blowing air that felt far too cold, but neither of us made a move to adjust the dials. Eleanor asked the question again, wondering aloud why she would do something so terrible. The truth was, I knew exactly why. I had known for months, perhaps even longer, but I had deliberately chosen to blind myself to the reality of the situation. Chloe's behavior had been steadily intensifying over the 18 months following the engagement announcement. It began with small actions. She would constantly talk over Eleanor during family dinners, correct her statements in front of dinner guests, and drop passive-aggressive remarks about Eleanor's wardrobe being entirely outdated or her home decor being far too traditional. During the previous Thanksgiving holiday, Chloe had openly told Eleanor that her homemade side dish looked like a desperate attempt to win approval. Then, at the engagement celebration in December, Chloe had intentionally assigned Eleanor to a distant side table, completely separated from the immediate family members. When Eleanor questioned a seating arrangement later, Chloe claimed it was a simple issue with the venue's floor plan, and Julian immediately backed her statement. Just 2 months prior, in April, right after the final wardrobe alterations, Chloe had turned to Julian right in front of Eleanor and stated that once the marriage was official, the family dynamics were going to change significantly. Eleanor had confided in me that very evening. I had dismissed it, telling her it was likely just standard wedding anxiety, the pressure of coordinating a massive event, and a bride simply wanting to maintain control. I was completely wrong. I drove us directly to the downtown Marriott where we had booked a suite for the weekend. I helped Eleanor step out of the vehicle. A nearby couple exiting their own car stared openly at her ruined dress, but they had the decency to remain silent. I guided Eleanor through the main lobby. The receptionist's eyes widened in surprise, but she kept her mouth shut as we boarded the elevator. The moment we walked into our room, Eleanor went straight to the bathroom, and I heard the sound of the shower turning on. I sat down heavily on the edge of the mattress and pulled my phone from my pocket. My hands were shaking slightly, not violently, but just enough that I had to set the device down on the nightstand and focus on my breathing for a minute before picking it up again. I opened my mobile banking application and navigated to a specific account I had established 5 years ago, an account Julian knew absolutely nothing about. It was the fund I had been utilizing to quietly inject financial support into Julian's life without causing a scene or making him feel diminished. Over those 5 years, the total accumulation exceeded $200,000. It included costly vehicle repairs that I quietly transformed into financial gifts, credit card balances I cleared out without ever mentioning them, and the substantial down payment for the residential property they were scheduled to officially close next Friday. That down payment amounted to $60,000, and it was currently sitting in an escrow account, scheduled for an automated transfer on Monday morning. On top of that, there were the wedding expenditures totaling $42,000. I had funded the photographer, the floral arrangements, the rehearsal dinner space, the honeymoon suite upgrades, and the private transportation. Essentially, everything except the actual chapel rental and the food catering, which Chloe's parents had covered. I had handled it all in secret because Julian had begged me to, claiming Chloe was incredibly sensitive regarding financial matters and shouldn't know the details. When I firmly insisted on signing the actual vendor contracts myself instead of putting Julian's name on the paperwork, telling him it simply made the bookkeeping cleaner, he had agreed without looking into it too deeply. In that moment, he didn't realize what those signatures actually meant. He didn't comprehend that I was the official client on record, which gave me the absolute legal authority to terminate the agreements. I also checked the other account, the educational trust I had established 2 years ago when Julian mentioned that they intended to start a family in the near future. $50,000 was sitting there, ready to accumulate interest for future grandchildren that did not yet exist. Chloe had deliberately shoved my wife into the dirt at her own wedding celebration and laughed about it. Before I made single phone call to the vendors, I decided to take one additional step. I opened up Instagram and searched for the profile of Chloe's maid of honor, Vanessa. I distinctly remember seeing her recording the entire incident on her device, standing off to the side near the reception table, holding her phone high with a massive smile on her face, as if she were capturing a hilarious comedy routine. I scrolled through her posted stories. Sure enough, she had already uploaded the video clip to a restricted group. I could see the metrics showing that 8 people had already viewed it. I immediately took screenshots of everything visible on the screen and saved the raw video file directly to my personal secure cloud storage. With the evidence secured, I proceeded to make 3 consecutive calls. My first call was to my personal financial manager, Marcus. He picked up on the second ring. I told him I needed an immediate halt placed on the automated wire transfer scheduled for Monday morning, the $60,000 moving from my secondary account to Julian and Chloe. I explained it was the property down payment for their Friday closing and instructed him to cancel it entirely. An intense silence filled the line before Marcus spoke up, asking if I was absolutely certain, noting that pulling the funds would completely tank their real estate deal. I told him I was absolutely certain. He asked if I could share what had occurred, but I told him no. I heard the distinct sound of keyboard keys clicking over the line. He confirmed it was taken care of. The transfer was officially stopped, and they would receive a formal notification from the escrow company on Monday morning indicating the funds had failed to arrive. I thanked him and ended the call.
Next, I dialed our wedding photographer, Evelyn Vance. I had paid her $6,000 invoice in full the previous month, which meant my signature was on the paperwork as the official client. She answered after the 4th ring. I greeted her and explained that I was calling regarding the celebration she had just documented for Julian and Chloe. Evelyn sounded cheerful, remarking on how beautiful the ceremony had been and mentioning she had captured some incredible frames. I cut straight to the point, instructing her to immediately cease all work on those files. I told her I was officially revoking my permission for her to distribute any of the photographs to the newlyweds. A heavy silence filled the line before she stammered out a confused response, asking me to repeat myself. I advised her to review the terms of her contract, pointing out that my name occupied the client line and that I had settled the balance. I repeated my instruction that under no circumstances was she to hand over the digital assets to Julian or Chloe. I told her she could either process a refund or keep the funds, as the money didn't matter to me, but the images were not to be delivered. Evelyn sounded incredibly stressed, mentioning she had already received multiple text messages from Chloe demanding to know when the initial previews would be ready. I told her to look at the paperwork again, reinforcing that I was the client on record, making my directive completely legal and binding. I suggested she contact her legal counsel if she had any further concerns, and I disconnected the call before she could offer a rebuttal. My third call was to the floral designer, a man named Donald, who initially sounded utterly bewildered and then increasingly agitated. I didn't care about his frustration. I gave him the exact same directive: check the signature on the agreement, and ordered him to cancel the preservation process for the bridal bouquet Chloe had requested, telling him to either retain the cash or return it at his discretion. After that, I contacted the establishment that had hosted our rehearsal dinner. They still owed me a partial credit because our final beverage tab had fallen well below the initial estimate, so I instructed them to simply keep the remaining balance. Finally, I phoned the luxury resort downtown where I had personally funded a massive suite upgrade for the couple's honeymoon. I canceled the premium reservation on the spot, causing the booking to automatically revert to the basic standard room Julian had originally secured using his own credit card. Every single independent vendor I had contracted with, every service I had covered, and every single upgrade I had financed was completely dismantled, canceled, or frozen within the strict boundaries of my legal rights. The entire process took roughly 45 minutes. By the time Eleanor stepped out of the bathroom, she was wrapped in a plush hotel robe. Her hair was completely damp, her eyes were severely red-shot, and she walked over to sit on the edge of the mattress right beside me. She looked at the device resting in my hands and quietly asked what I was doing. I looked her in the eyes and told her I was taking back what belonged to me. She blinked, processing my words, and noted that it was their wedding day. I reminded her that Chloe deliberately shoved her into the wet earth in front of 200 onlookers and then laughed about the humiliation. I told her flatly that I refused to finance that behavior and I refused to reward it. Eleanor remained silent for a long time, staring down at the floor. Eventually, she asked for specifics on what exactly had been canceled. I laid it out for her completely: the real estate down payment, the professional photography, the custom floral arrangements, and the premium honeymoon accommodations. When I finished speaking, the tears began rolling down her cheeks once again. She pointed out that they were going to lose their future home and that Julian would absolutely despise me for this, warning that it could completely destroy my relationship with our son. I told her that was highly likely, but I wouldn't be able to look at my own reflection in the mirror if I continued to pump money into the life of someone who believed that level of cruelty was acceptable. Eleanor placed her hand on mine, and we just sat there in the quiet room. Outside the window, the daylight was fading completely, replaced by the distant hum of city traffic and the occasional sound of people laughing as they walked down the hotel corridor. After a long period of silence, Eleanor spoke up again, stating she had been analyzing why the confrontation had happened in the first place. I told her to share her thoughts. She explained that she had been making her way back from the restroom facilities when she noticed Chloe standing near the stone staircase leading to the gardens. Chloe was deep in conversation with her mother, Martha. The moment Chloe spotted Eleanor approaching, she muttered something sharply to her mother, prompting Martha to immediately turn and walk away. Then Chloe stepped directly into Eleanor's path and told her that they needed to have a serious discussion about her behavior. I pressed for clarity, asking what Chloe meant by that. Eleanor explained that she had asked for clarification, to which Chloe snapped that Eleanor had been constantly inserting herself into the wedding festivities all day long, being too visible and trying to steal the spotlight instead of letting it remain on the bride. Eleanor told her she had absolutely no idea what she was talking about, but Chloe doubled down, stating firmly that it was her day, not Eleanor's, and commanded her to back off.
Eleanor's voice remained remarkably steady as she recounted the dialogue. She told Chloe she was simply there to offer love and support to Julian, and that was the exact moment Chloe placed both hands on her shoulders and delivered a massive shove. I absorbed the information, trying to piece together the timeline. I asked if anything notable had happened earlier in the day to trigger that kind of hostility. Eleanor insisted nothing out of the ordinary had occurred. She had helped fasten the intricate bustle on Chloe's dress before the photography session, ensured the young flower girls had their baskets ready, and spent time greeting the arriving guests. Standard, traditional mother-of-the-groom responsibilities. Then she paused, remembering a minor interaction during the cocktail hour. She mentioned that an acquaintance had asked where Julian had run off to, and she had simply answered that he and Chloe were down by the stone fountain taking additional portraits. That was the entire exchange. She had merely informed a guest of her son's location, and Chloe must have overheard it. It was entirely absurd, but that was the catalyst. Chloe had twisted a simple, helpful answer about Julian's whereabouts into an act of calculated sabotage, deciding that Eleanor was trying to hijack the event. And in Chloe's mind, the appropriate, justifiable response to that perceived slight was physical violence. We ordered service to the suite that evening, but neither of us could manage more than a few bites. The TV remained on in the background, a blur of moving shapes and noise that we completely ignored. Eventually, Eleanor drifted off to sleep fully clothed on top of the bed covers.
I stayed awake for hours, stared at the ceiling, and replayed the image of Julian's face over and over. The way he had leaned in and whispered that joke to Chloe, making her laugh while his mother lay in the dirt. I thought about the 18 months of subtle warnings I had dismissed as mere wedding anxiety, and I thought about the reality that I had just tanked my own son's real estate closing, and he had absolutely no clue what was coming. At 2 o'clock in the morning, my screen lit up with a text message from Chloe. She asked what had happened after we left, stating that everything had completely fallen apart and begging me to call her immediately. I didn't dial her number. I powered down the device, closed my eyes, and tried to catch whatever sleep I could. Before I explained the fallout on Monday morning when Julian finally discovered what I had executed, I have to ask a fundamental question. If an individual intentionally shoved your spouse into a mud pit at your child's wedding in front of 200 people and your own child stood there and shared a laugh with the perpetrator, how would you respond? Would you continue to bankroll their existence as if nothing occurred? Or would you draw a firm, unyielding line in the sand? Because the events that followed transformed our family dynamic permanently. On Sunday morning, Chloe called my phone exactly at 8 o'clock. I had been awake since 5, while Eleanor remained asleep beside me. Chloe immediately asked for an explanation regarding the previous evening, repeating that the entire reception had collapsed into chaos after our departure. I asked her to clarify. She explained that her brother's new wife was absolutely livid because of my stunt with the microphone, shouting that I had completely ruined her special day. Julian had spent the remainder of the evening frantically attempting to pacify her bride. Half of the invited guests packed up and left early, turning the reception into a total embarrassment. I told her flatly that I was glad to hear it. Chloe paused, then reminded me that the woman had physically assaulted our mother in public and laughed about it, stating she refused to play along and act like that was acceptable behavior. Chloe agreed, saying she had witnessed the entire thing and found it completely repulsive. But then her tone shifted, and she revealed that Julian was in a state of absolute panic. She mentioned he'd been calling her mobile phone every single hour since the previous night. He wouldn't specify what was wrong, but he sounded completely terrified. I told her he would get his answers the following morning. When she pressed for details about what that meant, I simply stated he would know everything Monday morning. Chloe went silent for a few beats before asking directly what I had done. I told her I had simply made the decision to stop financing cruelty. She argued that wasn't a real explanation, but I told her it was the only one I could provide at the moment. She let out a heavy sigh and warned me that he was going to call me, telling me to be prepared. I assured her I was ready. On Monday morning, Julian's first call came through at exactly 7:45. I let it ring. He called a second time, and I hit the decline button. The third time the screen lit up, I finally answered. His voice came through the speaker instantly, demanding to know what I had done. I calmly wished him a good morning. He ignored the greeting, yelling that the escrow representative had just contacted them to state that the down payment funds had failed to arrive, and they informed him that the wire transfer had been personally canceled by me. I told him that was absolutely correct. He stammered in disbelief, asking why he would do that to him. I told him very clearly that I was not going to buy a house for someone who shoves my wife in the dirt. A stunned silence filled the line before Julian tried to argue, claiming it was an accident and his bride didn't mean for it to happen. I cut him off immediately, stating I had been standing right there and watched the entire sequence. She had placed both hands firmly on Eleanor's shoulders and delivered a calculated shove. I told her that wasn't an accident, it was a physical assault. Julian scrambled for excuses, claiming she was incredibly emotional and that the pressure of the wedding had gotten to her. He revealed that she and Eleanor had been in an argument earlier in the day. I demanded to know the subject of the dispute. He hesitated over the line before admitting that his wife felt Eleanor was inserting herself too much into the festivities and being far too visible. He claimed she just needed some physical space, so she pushed her into the garden bed. He tried to plead with me, stating it wasn't as malicious as it looked, and reminding me that their closing date was this coming Friday. He explained that if they didn't produce the down payment, the contract would default and they would lose the earnest money deposit along with the entire property. I told him he should have weighed those financial consequences before he wrapped his arm around his bride while his mother was still sitting in the mud. He tried to deny it, claiming he didn't laugh at the situation. I corrected him immediately, stating I was standing a mere yards away. I saw him lean in, I saw him whisper into her ear, I watched her laugh, and I watched him smile. The line went dead quiet. Julian finally admitted he was simply trying to manage the situation because his wife was highly agitated and he thought making light of it would keep her calm. He begged me to initiate the wire transfer, promising he would have a serious talk with her and ensure she apologized to fix the mess. I gave him a definitive no. Julian cried out in desperation, but I asked him if he had any real conception of the sheer volume of wealth I had quietly funneled into his life over the previous 5 years. I listed the wedding vendors I had covered in secret so his bride's ego wouldn't be bruised, the costly mechanical repairs, the credit card balances cleared when his employment bonuses fell short, and now the residential down payment, totaling well over $200,000 because he was my son and I wanted to support him. I told him he repaid that generosity by standing idly by while his wife assaulted his mother. He claimed he simply froze and didn't know how to react. I told him a real man defends his mother, steps between them, tells his wife her actions are completely intolerable, and helps her mother up off the ground. I told him he should have done literally anything other than turn the humiliation into a private joke. He muttered he was sorry, and I told him I was sorry, before hanging up the phone.
10 minutes later, Evelyn, the photographer, dialed my number. She sounded highly stressed, explaining that the bride was practically screaming at her over the phone, demanding the images, and she had relayed my directive to her. She warned me that the woman was now threatening to file a lawsuit against her studio. I told her to let her proceed with the suit, reassuring her that she would easily win because my signature occupied the client line on the binding contract. That very afternoon, my phone buzzed with an incoming text message, but it wasn't the explosive call I had predicted. Instead, it was a meticulously constructed message from my new daughter-in-law. The text stated that she believed a massive misunderstanding had taken place and expressed the desire to speak when I was composed. She claimed what happened with Eleanor was never her explicit intention and offered an apology if my wife had sustained any injuries. I read the words twice. The psychological framing of the message was almost impressive. Never my intention. Sorry if she was hurt. It was a classic corporate disclaimer disguised as an apology, completely devoid of any actual accountability for her physical actions, designed solely to give her legal cover so she could claim she attempted to make amends. I chose not to type a response. Exactly 1 hour later, she abandoned the diplomatic facade and called my line directly, her voice dripping with pure rage. She demanded to know what the hell I thought I was doing. I told her simply that I was removing my financial backing. She screamed that she had already sent a written apology, but I corrected her, stating that a disclaimer expressing regret if someone was injured is not an apology. She yelled that the entire situation was completely insane, pointing out that we had signed agreements with the photography studio and other businesses. I reminded her that the agreements were between the vendors and myself, as I was the paying client, not her. She snarled that my actions were going to completely ruin Julian's life. I told her flatly that she had sealed that fate the moment she decided humiliating her mother was an acceptable form of entertainment, and she slammed the phone down. That evening, Eleanor looked at me from across the hotel room and asked if I had truly gone through with canceling the residential down payment. I confirmed that I had. She looked distressed, reminding me that the property was supposed to be their future home and that they would lose everything. I told her I was well aware of that reality. She sat in silence for several minutes before admitting that she didn't want me taking these extreme measures on her behalf if it meant permanently shattering my bond with Julian. I looked at her and reiterated that the woman intentionally shoved her into the dirt at her own wedding and locked her, while Julian stood by and did absolutely nothing. I made it clear that I refused to fund that lifestyle, reward that behavior, or pretend the incident never happened. Eleanor then raised a painful point, asking about potential future grandchildren and noting that we would likely be entirely barred from their lives. That realization hit me incredibly hard, because I knew she was completely right. If Julian and his wife eventually had children, this boundary meant that we would almost certainly be completely excluded from their upbringing. I acknowledged the cost, but told her firmly that I wouldn't be able to look at myself in the mirror if I continued to finance an individual who treated her with such utter contempt. On Wednesday, Arthur Finch contacted my phone directly. He stated that we needed to have a serious conversation regarding the events at the wedding. I told him I was listening. He explained that his daughter had given him her version of the events, claiming Eleanor had been incredibly difficult and overbearing throughout the entire day. According to her, she simply got overwhelmed, leading to an isolated incident that had now been wildly blown out of proportion. I corrected him immediately, stating that his daughter had physically assaulted my wife by shoving her into a mud pit in front of 200 witnesses, including himself. Arthur hemmed and hawed, claiming he saw a brief scuffle but didn't have the full context of what sparked it. I told him the context was entirely irrelevant because there is no context that justifies placing your hands on someone and slamming them into the ground. Arthur tried to minimize it, stating that young women get incredibly emotional and weddings are highly stressful environments. He added that his daughter had already apologized to Julian and asked if we could all just move past the drama. I asked him flatly if she had delivered an apology to Eleanor. The line went completely quiet for a moment before he promised he would personally ensure she did. I told him that didn't answer my question. Arthur's tone grew sharp, and he reminded me that Julian and his daughter were on the verge of losing their entire real estate purchase because I had revoked the funding, stating that I was actively ruining his daughter's future stability. I countered that his daughter should have heavily weighed the impact on her future before she chose to assault my wife on her wedding day. He spat out that I was being incredibly vindictive, but I told him I was simply being protective of my family, and he abruptly cut the line. Later that same afternoon, Julian arrived at our primary residence completely unannounced. When I pulled open the front door, he was standing on the porch wearing the exact same clothes from the wedding day, completely wrinkled as if he'd slept in them. He looked up at me and stated he wasn't there to beg for the money, but he desperately needed me to understand his perspective. I stepped aside and allowed him to enter. Eleanor remained completely out of sight in the kitchen, but the absolute quiet in the house made it obvious she was listening to every word. We sat down in the living room, and Julian immediately began defending his bride, claiming she wasn't an inherently evil person. He explained that she struggles with intense anxiety whenever she feels like she is losing control over a major life milestone. He admits she does incredibly foolish things when panicked, adding that the wedding was the single most important day of her existence, and she genuinely believed Eleanor was attempting to sabotage her moment. I cut him off, pronouncing his name firmly.
I reminded him that his mother was simply walking back from using the restroom and hadn't executed a single provocative action. Julian pressed his palms together, looking down, and admitted he knew that was the truth. He explained his wife had worked herself into an irrational frenzy all day, completely convincing herself that Eleanor was trying to outshine her moment. He confessed he knew the behavior was completely unhinged and that he should have handled her anxiety before the reception ever began. But he failed to act. He looked up at me with bloodshot eyes and confessed that when the push actually happened, he completely froze in shock.
He swore that was the absolute truth. He knew it was horribly wrong, but he panicked and couldn't move. I reminded him that he had whispered something to her that prompted a massive laugh. Julian explained that he had merely told her they needed to get her a drink, claiming he was frantically pulling her away from the viewing crowd before she escalated the scene even further. He insisted he wasn't sharing a joke or condoning her actions, but acknowledged how terrible it looked to everyone watching. I told him flatly that it looked exactly like he was choosing his bride over his own mother. He went quiet, absorbing the weight of my words. Julian repeated that he wasn't there to demand the down payment back. He just needed me to know that he recognized his ultimate failure as a son and wanted to express his profound regret. I told him that I wasn't the individual who needed to hear that statement. He needed to deliver those exact words to his mother. He stood up and walked straight into the kitchen. I remained behind in the living room, allowing them their privacy. I could hear the muffled sound of their voices, low, hesitant, and heavy with emotion. At a certain point, I heard Eleanor break down into tears, and I am fairly certain Julian did as well. When he finally exited the house an hour later, the core financial and relational issues remained entirely unresolved, but a distinct shift had occurred in the atmosphere. 3 days following that encounter, Julian's wife took it upon herself to call Eleanor directly on her personal phone. Eleanor recounted the entire dialogue to me that evening, her voice completely deadpan and devoid of emotion. She explained that the woman had actually demanded Eleanor deliver a formal apology to her for supposedly undermining her authority throughout the wedding weekend. She had the audacity to state that if Eleanor humbled herself and apologized, she would consider granting her forgiveness. The moment the story left Eleanor's lips, I grabbed my phone, opened the banking application, and navigated directly to the educational fund. The $50,000 that had been sitting there for 2 years, intended for future grandchildren who did not exist, was liquidated. I initiated an immediate transfer, moving every single penny back into my primary checking account. I didn't bother mentioning the action to Julian. He would discover the empty account when the time came. On Friday morning, Julian dialed my number again. His voice was laced with pure defeat as he informed me that they had officially lost the residential property. Because they couldn't produce the down payment by the closing deadline, the sellers had legally terminated the contract and retained the $10,000 earnest money deposit. I told him I was incredibly sorry to hear that. Julian snapped, asking if I was truly sorry, accusing me of being the direct catalyst for their financial ruin. I corrected him firmly, stating that his wife was the sole catalyst when she chose to physically assault his mother in public. I had simply made the executive decision to stop insulating them from the financial consequences of their cruelty. Julian then revealed that due to the loss of the home and their completely depleted savings, they were being forced to pack up their belongings and move directly into his wife's childhood bedroom at her parents' estate. He yelled, asking if he comprehended the sheer humiliation of their situation, accusing me of playing manipulative games with their livelihood. I told him I wasn't playing a single game. I was drawing an unyielding line. I told him what was truly cruel was watching a 61-year-old woman get shoved into the mud for personal amusement, followed by his wife labeling her dramatic for being deeply traumatized by the event. And the ultimate act of cruelty was him standing there as an eyewitness and doing absolutely nothing to protect her. He stammered that he had already apologized to me. I reminded him that he had apologized to me, but he had failed to offer a real unconditional apology to his mother. The line went completely silent. I told him flatly that he made the wrong choice on his wedding day, and now he was forced to live with the reality of that choice. I added that if he wanted the current consequences to alter, he knew exactly what actions needed to take place. Julian muttered that his wife flatly refused to apologize, maintaining that Eleanor was the one who owed amends. I told him that if that was her permanent stance, he was going to have an extraordinarily expensive and miserable marriage, and I ended the call. Over the course of the following month, the isolation from our son became absolute. Julian completely stopped calling my phone, and his wife blocked our accounts across every single social media platform. Chloe kept us informed, reporting that the newlyweds were locked in constant, bitter arguments. The immense financial pressure, the blame shifting, and the deep public shame of being forced to reside in her childhood bedroom had completely turned their home life into a pressure cooker. In the middle of July, Vanessa, the maid of honor, made the executive decision to upload the raw video footage of the garden push directly onto TikTok. She added a mocking caption about what happens when a mother-in-law steps out of line at a wedding, and the clip exploded, accumulating over 400,000 views in 2 days' matter. The public comment section was severely fractured. Half of the viewers were completely horrified by the physical assault. The other half viewed it as a hilarious piece of wedding drama. Eleanor stumbled across the post online. She quietly closed her laptop screen, stood up, and walked straight into the bedroom without uttering a single word. Fortunately, I had already secured the high-definition copy of the footage on the night of the event, long before Vanessa made it public entertainment. I dialed Julian's number that evening and told him he needed to look at something immediately, hitting the send button on the file. He dialed me back exactly 20 minutes later, completely silent at first. I broke the quiet, telling him that what he just watched was the complete, unedited sequence, including the footage of his wife's face as she walked away from the mess. I told him he needed to see what the rest of the world was looking at, rather than the distorted version he had rationalized in his head. I let the reality sink in, warning him that the digital footprint of that video would follow his new family for a long time, and I wanted him to understand exactly what behavior he was defending. He hung up the phone without offering an argument, but he didn't call back to dispute my words. By August, Julian and his wife had officially entered intensive marriage counseling. The sessions were reportedly disastrous. She blamed Julian entirely for failing to secure the real estate down payment from me, while Julian threw the blame back at her for completely alienating his parents. Chloe admitted the situation had grown incredibly toxic. I asked if a legal separation was on the horizon, but she couldn't give a definitive answer, noting it was highly likely.
In September, Eleanor looked over at me and expressed a desire to reach out to Julian directly, wanting to see if there was any possible way to salvage our relationship with him. I asked if she was absolutely certain she wanted to expose herself to that stress again. She admitted she wasn't sure, but stated simply that she deeply missed her son. She initiated the call, and the two of them conversed for over an hour. When she finally disconnected, her eyes were wet with tears, but her posture was incredibly firm. She explained that Julian had offered a profound, tearful apology to her. He confessed that his wife was deeply flawed and he possessed no power to alter her personality. He stated desperately that he wanted us back in his life, but his wife had laid down a strict ultimatum. He was forbidden from interacting with us unless I delivered a formal apology to her for generating unnecessary wedding drama. I scoffed, stating that we hadn't generated a single piece of the conflict. Eleanor agreed, reinforcing that she had no intention of apologizing for being physically assaulted at a reception. But then she looked at me intentionally, suggesting we needed to engineer a strategy to keep our arms open for Julian without making our bond dependent on his wife's actions. She pointed out that he was completely trapped, and if we forced him to choose a side between his vows and his parents, we risked losing him permanently. She proposed that we explicitly inform him that he was always welcome in our home, that our love for him was completely unconditional, and that if his marriage ultimately collapsed, he wouldn't have to rebuild his life from absolute zero. I sat with that perspective for a long time, realizing it was vastly different from offering forgiveness to his abuser. Eleanor agreed that it was, and I knew her wisdom was entirely correct.
By October, Julian and his wife had officially initiated a legal separation. Chloe kept us informed, confirming that the woman had packed her bags and returned permanently to her parents' estate. Julian was left entirely devastated, and he reached out to see if he could come visit us. I told Chloe to let him know the door was completely unlocked. He arrived at our home the following weekend, looking incredibly thin and drained, carrying the specific kind of profound exhaustion that comes from fighting a losing battle with your own conscience for months. We sat down together in the living room, while Eleanor remained in the kitchen preparing coffee. Julian looked down at his hands and offered a sincere apology for everything, for failing to stand up for his mother, for making the wrong choice, and for letting things escalate so far. I asked him what had finally caused the marriage to break. He explained that the sudden lack of financial backing completely shattered their dynamic. His wife couldn't cope with the reality of living in her childhood bedroom, nor could she handle the public embarrassment of being the couple who defaulted on their home contract. She constantly degraded him for failing to manipulate me into handing over the funds, openly labeling him weak. He paused, admitting that perhaps he had been weak for not stopping her behavior at the very beginning. I told him he had already acknowledged that fact, and he nodded, stating he simply needed to say it out loud again. Eleanor walked into the room carrying the coffee service. She set a cup gently in front of our son and took a seat right beside me. She looked at him and explained that while she had granted him forgiveness weeks ago, he needed to truly understand the depth of the damage. His wife had humiliated her in front of everyone they knew, and for months neither of them had offered a genuine, unprompted apology. She admitted she had spent that time believing her own son valued his wife's fragile ego over her mother's basic human dignity. Julian looked at her with tears in his eyes, whispering that he knew it was wrong every single day. Eleanor nodded, stating that his realization was the exact reason we were all sitting in the room together again. We spent the next 2 hours talking through the pain. It didn't instantly repair the fractured trust, but it was a solid foundation to build upon. In November, Julian officially filed the paperwork for divorce. The process immediately turned incredibly ugly. His wife contested the filing, demanding permanent financial alimony, a full reimbursement for the wedding expenditures her family had covered, and an equal split of Julian's retirement portfolio, despite the marriage lasting less than a full year. Then, in December, I received a medical diagnosis of early-stage prostate cancer. The specialists assured us it was highly treatable and carried an excellent prognosis due to being detected so early. The moment the news dropped, Eleanor sat beside me on the mattress, squeezed my hand tightly, and stated firmly that we would face it together. I contacted Julian that same evening, and he drove across town without a moment's hesitation, staying with us until the early hours of the morning. We deliberately avoided the topics of his impending divorce or our past financial disputes, choosing instead to focus entirely on family stability. The following afternoon, I sat Julian down for a private conversation regarding my estate planning. I informed him that I was officially restructuring my legal will. I made it clear that he was absolutely remaining as a beneficiary, but the inheritance would come with strict legal parameters. The assets would be held exclusively within a protected trust, ensuring they remained entirely his independent property and completely shielded from any future marital liabilities. Julian nodded, stating he fully understood the necessity of the decision. I also told him flatly that I harbored zero regrets regarding the cancellation of the property down payment or the termination of the wedding vendor services, because his mother never deserved the treatment she received. Julian looked at me and stated that he knew. A certain emotional distance still lingered between us, but for the first time in a year, we were standing on the exact same side of the line. In January, the legal representation for Julian's estranged wife reached out to my own attorney with an unexpected update. She had completely retracted her aggressive demands for ongoing alimony, expressing she simply wanted the legal proceedings concluded as swiftly as possible. The official divorce decree was finalized by the court in March. Julian secured a modest apartment in the downtown district, initiating the grueling process of rebuilding his life from the ground up at 36 years old. Eleanor and I made it a strict routine to gather with him once a week for a family dinner. Together, we were slowly reconstructing a bond that had shattered into pieces on an estate terrace, on a day when 200 onlookers chose to witness an act of cruelty, and one father decided he would no longer finance it. In April, Chloe shared the wonderful news that she was expecting a child. It would be our first grandchild, and the announcement brought tears of absolute joy to Eleanor's eyes. Chloe asked if we would be willing to assist with childcare once the infant arrived, and Eleanor immediately promised we would be there every single day if necessary.
That evening, as we lay awake in the quiet of our bedroom, Eleanor turned to me and asked if I truly believed we had executed the right choice a year ago. I looked at her and stated that my only metric of success was ensuring her protection. She sighed softly, noting that our decision had cost us a full year of connection with our son. I reminded her that we had lost that year because of a deliberate choice Julian had made, and I had simply refused to bankroll the fallout of that choice. Chloe's delivery date is anticipated for this coming September, and Eleanor has already filled the living room with yarn, knitting custom blankets for the arrival. Julian recently approached his sister to ask if he could be present at the medical facility during the labor, expressing a deep desire to be an exemplary uncle to the child. I assured him that he would excel in that role. We are continuing to mend our family structure, taking it one day at a time, anchoring everything in an honest dialogue that was desperately lacking before the crisis. Now, every time I issue a check to assist Chloe with the nursery renovations or the purchase of infant furniture, I never find myself questioning if my support is too substantial. Generosity was never the fundamental issue in our family. The true issue was providing financial power to an individual who believed that causing physical harm and public humiliation to my wife was nothing more than a joke. The official wedding images were never processed or delivered to the couple, meaning no formal pictorial record of that celebration exists anywhere in the world. There are simply 200 human witnesses, a legal marriage that dissolved in less than 12 months, and a firm boundary I established to cease the funding of cruelty, even when it meant walking a lonely path without my son for a little while. On rare occasions, Julian will mention his former spouse in passing. She has apparently become engaged once again, rekindling a relationship with an individual she dated during her university years. I always tell him that I genuinely wish her well, and I mean those words sincerely. We no longer speak about the grand terrace, the wet garden bed, or the microphone, but every so often I will catch Eleanor staring quietly at her hands, and I know her mind has drifted back to that afternoon. Even on the difficult days when the memory still carries a dull ache, I know with absolute certainty that I will never regret stopping the money. If you enjoyed this story, please subscribe to the channel for more. Don't forget to click on the video showing up on your screen right now. Trust me, you won't want to miss what happens next.